radio in Unit 12 crackled, cutting through the morning quiet of downtown Bridgeport. Call just came in. Vehicle break-in on Fairfield Avenue. Suspect's a black male, maybe mid-30s. Dark jacket. Officer Greg Keller exchanged a weary glance with his partner, Chloe Russo. Another Tuesday, another generic call. 10 to 1, he's still hanging around, Keller grumbled, his eyes scanning the street. He pointed with his chin. And would you look at that? There, outside the Daily Rise bakery, stood a man who loosely fit the description. He was sharply dressed, dark jeans, expensive-looking boots, and a tailored jacket that screamed money. He was calm, focused on his phone, a small paper bag in his hand. Too calm, Keller thought. Too clean for this neighborhood. That alone was enough. Keller swerved the cruiser to the curb, killing the engine without bothering with the lights. Before the car had fully stopped, Russo was out, her voice sharp and loud. "You! Let me see your hands! Now!" The man, John Creed, looked up from his phone. There was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but no fear. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You heard her," Keller said, stepping out and letting his hand fall casually to his sidearm. "You match the description of a car thief." A line of confusion creased John's brow. "I'm waiting for my ride," and he said, his voice perfectly even. "I just bought a pastry." Russo let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you did. We'll sort out your story downtown." Before John could say another word, Keller stepped forward and deliberately smacked the bag from his hand. A warm almond croissant tumbled onto the grimy sidewalk. He then grabbed John's arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him against the cold metal of the patrol car. "What's the matter? A little jumpy now?" Keller barked, raising his voice for the benefit of the few people who had started to watch, their phones suddenly out and recording. John didn't flinch. He didn't struggle. He simply went still, his gaze fixed on the ground as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. Russo leaned in close to Keller, a smirk playing on her lips. "It's always the same," she whispered. "They talk a big game right until those cuffs click shut. Probably has a whole sob story ready to go," Keller shot back with a laugh. "They didn't ask for his ID. They didn't read him his rights. They didn't even glance at the receipt that had fluttered out of the bag and now lay next to the crushed pastry. They just shoved him into the back of Unit 12 and drove away, already joking about the easy arrest." Inside the car, John stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "Got anything you want to say for yourself back there?" Keller called out from the front seat. John's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with absolute clarity. "I need to make a phone call." "You'll get your call," Russo scoffed without turning around. "Right after we book you and run your prints." But it was the way he said it, that calm, almost detached tone, the sound of a man who was not asking, but stating a fact, planted the first tiny seed of doubt. It wasn't enough to make them reconsider, but it was enough to make Keller's eyes flick to the rearview mirror. The man wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who was simply waiting. At the precinct, the booking sergeant, a weary veteran named Miles Corrigan, looked up as they brought John in. Corrigan's eyes did a slow scan of the man in cuffs, the expensive boots, the tailored jacket, the look of unnerving composure. "Keller, you two sure about this one?" Corrigan asked, his voice low enough not to carry. "He fit the bolo. Car theft. He was casing the street," Keller said dismissively. "I was standing outside a bakery," John corrected him, his voice still quiet. Russo stepped forward, her posture instantly aggressive. "Are you questioning our judgment in the field, Miles?" Corrigan held her gaze for a moment, then sighed and turned to his computer. He began typing in John's details. He stared at the screen, blinked, and then leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. "This address, there's no way this is right. I would like to make my phone call now," John repeated, his tone polite but firm. Keller rolled his eyes. "Who are you going to call, your public defender?" "No," John said simply. "I'm calling the Inspector General's office." The air in the room went still for a second. Then Keller exploded with a loud, ugly laugh. "The IG's office? That's a good one. Go right ahead, pal. Tell him we said hello." He and Russo turned and walked away, still chuckling. But Miles Corrigan wasn't laughing. The color was draining from his face as he stared at the monitor. What the two arrogant officers didn't know was that they hadn't just made a mistake. They were already sinking, and the water was rising fast. The holding cell was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. John Creed sat on the concrete bench, his posture perfect, his hands resting on his knees. He was a portrait of absolute control. Patience, he thought. His mother had taught him that. She taught him how to wait, how to watch, and how to let a corrupt system hang itself with its own rope. Down the hall, Keller grabbed a soda from a vending machine. "You see the look on that guy's face?" he said to Russo. "Like he's some kind of royalty." Russo took a bitter sip of her burnt coffee. "That kind always does," she sneered. "Waltzes into a decent neighborhood dressed like that and thinks the laws don't apply to him. It's the same playbook every single time," Keller chuckled. "My favorite part is when they threaten to sue you and demand your badge number. Like we've never heard that before." Neither of them noticed Miles Corrigan slip away from his desk. He disappeared into a small back office and quietly picked up a secured phone line. A few minutes later, John Creed was finally given his phone call. Led to a grimy phone bolted to the wall, he didn't hesitate. He didn't need to look up a number. He simply lifted the receiver and dialed a 10-digit number purely from memory. When the other end picked up, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "This is Creed," he said. "Bridgeport PD, Fairfield Avenue incident. I want the complete preliminary file on my desk by noon." He hung up. No anger, no threats. Just a clean, decisive command. The call lasted less than 20 seconds, but a tidal wave was already hurtling toward the precinct. 30 minutes later, the precinct captain's private line buzzed. He glanced at the caller ID and his back went ramrod straight. It was a number from the state capitol, a number you answer before the second ring. Less than an hour after that, John Creed was released. Greg Keller saw him first. He and Russo were walking down the main hall when they both froze mid-step. John Creed was walking calmly toward them. He wasn't in cuffs. He wasn't being escorted by patrol officers. He was flanked by two men in dark, severe suits who moved with the quiet, unnerving confidence of federal agents. Keller blinked, the harsh, fluorescent lights suddenly feeling too bright. "That's impossible," he muttered. Russo's eyes narrowed, her face a hard mask of disbelief. "What in the hell is going on?" From behind his desk, Miles Corrigan watched the small procession pass. He said nothing. He simply turned to his computer terminal and, with a few swift keystrokes, entered a command into a system they didn't have access to, officially logging the release. John didn't look at the two officers. He didn't offer a smirk or a parting shot. He just left, with the same measured, confident stride he'd had when they first saw him. The silence he left behind was heavier and more menacing than any siren. That night, Keller tried to push it from his mind. "It's just politics," he told his brother over dinner. "The guy knows somebody, that's all. The whole thing stinks of it." Meanwhile, Russo sat on her porch with a beer, her thoughts churning. "Just a screw-up from downtown," she reasoned. "He'll get what's coming to him eventually. Nobody's that clean." But as the week dragged on, their excuses felt increasingly hollow. The whispers started. Conversations in the locker room would die the moment they walked in. Someone mentioned the name Creed during a morning briefing, and two sergeants exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Even their own captain grew distant, giving them clipped one-word answers whenever the arrest came up. That's what finally rattled Keller. When the top brass gets spooked, you know it's real. "We have the body cam footage," Russo insisted one afternoon, trying to convince him and herself. "We have the dispatch log. We followed protocol to the letter." Keller nodded, but the gesture felt empty. A cold knot was twisting in his gut. Something about John Creed was wrong, and the way he left, with no argument, no threats, no anger, that wasn't how a guilty man acted. They tried to fall back into the routine, but the ground was already shifting beneath their feet. They just hadn't realized that John Creed was the one standing on solid ground, watching them fall. The summons arrived a week later. The Bridgeport courthouse was their turf, a building of concrete and glass where they held all the power. They walked in together, uniforms pressed, badges gleaming, faces set in stone. This was just a formality. They expected to see John Creed in the waiting area with some slick, high-priced lawyer, ready to cause a scene. But he wasn't there. His name wasn't even on the public docket. A bailiff gave them a curt nod as they passed through security. "You two here for the Creed case in 4B? "That's us. Keller and Russo," Greg answered. The bailiff gave them a long, slow blink. "Creed's not the one on trial," Keller frowned. "Say again?" The bailiff just jerked his head toward the courtroom doors. "You'll see." The moment they pushed open the doors to courtroom 4B, their world turned upside down. The room was packed, but not with the usual collection of nervous defendants and their families. This room was filled with journalists, 2 news camera crews, and a city councilman. Keller's neck went stiff, and then his eyes locked on the front of the room. There, at a table beside the judge's bench, sat John Creed. He was dressed in a dark tailored suit, calmly reviewing a thick legal binder. He wore no handcuffs and had no lawyer. In front of him sat a polished brass nameplate, Inspector General, Connecticut Division of Civil Rights. Russo's voice was a strangled whisper. "What is this?" "It's an ambush," Keller breathed back, his mind reeling. The judge's gavel cracked down. "This session will now come to order," she announced. "We are here for a procedural review regarding a recent detainment. Mr. Creed is present in an advisory capacity, representing the state." Russo's jaw twitched. Keller looked like he'd been physically struck. And John Creed, the man they'd slammed against a car a week ago, didn't even grant them a glance. "Officers Keller and Russo, please approach," the judge commanded. They moved stiffly, feeling every eye in the room on them. "Explain your reasoning for the arrest," the judge said to Keller. "Your Honor, we had a bolo from dispatch." "And was an ID requested before applying cuffs?" she cut in. "He matched the description," Russo blurted, her voice tight. "And he was non-compliant." From the head table, John Creed's pen made a single, deliberate click. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Creed?" For the first time, John looked directly at them, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "this was never about one arrest. It's about a clear pattern. The Division of Civil Rights has authorized a full internal review of these officers' conduct." The formal review began with an email the next morning. The subject line was chilling: "Case file summary, prepared by Inspector General J. Creed." It was full of their old arrest reports and civilian statements. With a trembling hand, Keller opened a file for a man named Andre Bishop, detained 3 years ago for a cracked taillight. The report said the body cam footage was unrecoverable, but the man's statement was clear. He'd been thrown against his car for asking for a supervisor. Keller's chest tightened. This wasn't a review, it was an autopsy. The hearing took place in a sterile conference room, packed with silent observers from internal affairs. There were no friendly faces. At the head of the table, John Creed looked surgically prepared. "This isn't about accusations," John began. "It's about data." He laid out the files. Andre Bishop, Leon Hayes. Report after report echoed the same phrases. Fit the description. Uncooperative. Suspicious behavior. "We respond to the calls we get," Keller burst out. "But you decide who fits them," John countered, his voice like ice. "You control whether you check a man's name before you decide he's a criminal." He then unrolled a large map of Bridgeport, dotted with dozens of red pins. "This is every stop you two have made in 5 years." The pins formed thick, undeniable clusters over the same few neighborhoods. "You conduct 42% more stops than other units," John stated, his voice cold and factual. 80% involve black men. Over 90% result in no charges. The investigator beside him, Ms. Davies, added quietly, "That's not policing. It's harassment." "So we're being punished for doing our jobs?" Russo's voice cracked. "You're not being punished," John said. "You're being held accountable. This review was triggered because, for once, you stopped the wrong person." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto theirs. "Me," the word landed with the force of a physical blow. "I wasn't the Inspector General that day. I was just a man buying a pastry, and you decided that was enough." "We had a dispatch call," Keller protested. "You didn't have to target me," John replied. "You've built a system where the targeting is automatic. You can't fix what you won't admit." He presented testimony from past victims, stories of sprained wrists and families terrorized over minor stops. "We see the worst of people," Russo insisted. "Perhaps the problem is your definition of worst," John countered. "You claim the job is hard, but when the same people always pay the price for your comfort, it stops being about safety. It becomes about power, the comfort of always being the one on your feet." His final recommendation to the board was that both officers be permanently removed from field duty and that their past cases be formally reopened. Russo whispered one last time, "It was just a job." John looked at her, his expression unreadable. "No," he corrected, "it was a responsibility." The board upheld every recommendation. The end came an hour later in their captain's office. The two state investigators watched from the corner. "Your service weapons and your badges," the captain said, his voice heavy with finality. The sound of unclipped holsters echoed in the silence, followed by two soft, metallic clicks as they placed their shields on the desk. The symbols of the authority they had abused. It was over. As they walked out, stripped of their power, they passed Miles Corrigan in the hall. One of the state investigators caught the old sergeant's eye and gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement that justice finally had been served.